So on to our guest, Dr. Glenn D. Lowry, as he is known by some. I have known Glenn for a long time, and not since the day of his birth, which was back in 1954 in New York, and he went on to receive a bachelor's degree from Williams College and a master's and doctorate from Harvard University, and did so in the 1970s and early 80s. And he and his wife Susan have 3 kids, and he made his way in a very illustrious career as a museum director to Toronto, to the Art Gallery of Ontario, and left there to take on the Museum of Modern Art in 1995, where he has a staff of some 850 people and runs an active program of exhibitions and acquisitions, publications. And of course, over the last decade, he guided MoMA into a $900 million capital campaign for the renovation, expansion, and endowment of the museum, which really invigorated not only the historical collections, but also especially the contemporary program. And as a real advocate of contemporary art, he thought up, engineered, brought to fruition and success the merger with PS1 in devising a space for MoMA that could be a laboratory. And their merger was announced in February 1999. I remember it well, and with jealousy. And he has lectured and written a great deal about contemporary art and artists and the role of museums in society. He has many honors, as you would expect. He has a multitude of degrees that have been awarded him beyond those he has earned, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, serves on the advisory council of the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, and is on the steering committee for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. And the French government honored him with the title of Officier dans l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, and is the author of so many publications. One, has it already come out? Oil and Sugar, Contemporary Art and Islamic Culture, which just came out. So please help me in welcoming Glenn Lowry. So welcome. I took you on a rollerblading tour today, and thank you for your stamina, which is, he's an expert skier, so he has a great deal of stamina. But thank you for making the trip and coming in today.
Pleasure.
Before we get to what you're up now, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about how you got to MoMA, about some of the steps that you took to get there, and just some of the formative years that you had, to bring us a little bit in context.
Certainly. And first of all, let me just say what a pleasure it has been this afternoon to wander through the galleries with you, Max, and with some of your staff. It's really amazing what you have here. And one of the great joys that I get is traveling around the country and visiting on occasion places I've never been before, like Indianapolis, and being reminded that the strength, the richness, the significance of our country is the ability to have so many great museums led by so many great directors dotted across our landscape, and this is surely one of the best, and it's really been a great afternoon.
Thank you.
I came to the Museum of Modern Art by a very circuitous route. In fact, you could even say that I came to art history by a circuitous route. I went to college determined to either be an Olympic skier or a medical doctor. I had been lucky enough to ski on the U.S. Hopeful ski team in Europe the year before I went to Williams, and I had thought throughout my high school career that I could take my interest in biology and convert that into a medical degree. Both of these dreams were dashed within weeks of arriving at Williams College. Skiing went out the door when the coach of the Williams ski team told me that I needed to lose my girlfriend because the slopes were a man's world. I said no, and I married her instead. And my medical career vaporized one early morning when I realized that primate biology at 8 o'clock in the morning was just more than I could handle. The result of that actually was a complete, total meltdown and panic. And I eventually talked to an advisor of mine at Williams, and he said, and he really actually looked at me as if I had 3 heads, and he said, so you came to a liberal arts college and you're worried about what to do. Why don't you try some courses in subjects you've never thought about before and do something you've never done before? That's the whole beauty of a liberal arts education. So I sat down and I made a grid and I put on one vector were only courses that met in the afternoon, since I like to sleep late. The second vector was only courses that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays so I could have long weekends. You can see the beginning of a museum director right there. So when I filtered all of that down, it was a handful of courses that actually met those two critical criteria, one of which was a course on Indian and Islamic painting, taught by a man named Milo Beach. And I remember walking into that course in the spring of my freshman year, sat down, lights went out, up went the first slide, and I went, bam. Now I know what I want to do with the rest of my life. It was utterly electronic. It was like the coup de foudre. I saw something, a kind of world open up before me that it had struck me as utterly impossible that I could have been 18 years old or 19 years old and not have known anything about. I couldn't have told you where Iran was. I couldn't have told you who the Safavid dynasty was. I couldn't have told you anything. It seemed so inconceivable to me. And I drilled into that. I took lots of courses and got very excited. And I eventually went to Harvard to graduate school where I met Max. We were exact classmates. And I proceeded on the assumption that I would do my research at Harvard, graduate, and teach Islamic art and culture somewhere in the United States.
Well, let's stop there for a second and let's give everybody a sense of what that was like. There were 9 of us who entered the class in 1977, and at Harvard they apportioned the 9, and they did. You'd have somebody in ancient art, somebody in Islamic, somebody, so you covered the history of art with 9 people, and then you locked into either Mortal Kombat or collegial association. So what was it like? Or both. And so what was that formative couple of years in residence in Cambridge like for you?
It was actually fantastic. I mean, I went from a very small rural campus in Williamstown to Harvard, not having really thought about it. I went there to study with 2 professors and discovered the kind of ferment of being in a genuinely engaging intellectual environment. And also found that there were other people interested in the same material that I was interested in. So gravitated to the collegial side of this and actually met several people who subsequently became very close colleagues. We did exhibitions together, we wrote books together, we actually shared jobs over time, and I thought it was some of the most exhilarating years of my life. I mean, and I still go back to Harvard and realize that it was a place that you could go there to study Islamic art, but you could meet a classicist, you could meet somebody working on contemporary art, you could meet somebody whose field was ancient Mayan, and at the same time you could meet somebody who was studying law at the law school who was really interesting. And the kind of frisson of being around really intelligent people, all deeply engaged in what they were doing, was, I thought, extraordinarily nurturing.
But you were more grown up than the rest of us, because you and Susan were already married and an item and done, and the rest of us were wandering around in the pasture of Cambridge. And I think you applied yourself with more determination than the rest of us in some regards for that reason, I would say.
Well, you know, I was one of those kids that you had a really hard thing about this dating thing and trying to get that straightened out, so I figured get it out with really early. So I, you know, and it actually had the upside of that, actually, there's only been upside, but the real upside of that is I went to Harvard really very clear in my mind with what I wanted to do, and sort of on a fairly short fuse, because we were married and my wife was good enough to continue to work and essentially put me through school, but I realized there was going to be a quid pro quo, and the quid or the quo came much faster than I expected, because as I was starting my dissertation, my wife became pregnant with our first child, and suddenly I had this atavistic thing, which was, gotta get it done. Got to get it done. You know, you can go, the beauty of being in graduate school is you can contemplate a decade worth of research and drilling into the most minuscule minutiae. And actually Max was one of the few other graduate students there who I think really also had a sense of got to get it done. That, you know, yes, there was a pleasure of being able to think and learn, but that actually you were under some kind of almost personal obligation to bring it to some kind of closure. And I still feel that was the right, for me it was right to recognize that this was not going to be a 7-year stint at Harvard. It was going to be considerably shorter than that.
So then what happened after that?
So serendipity is one of the great things in life. I graduated, got my PhD from Harvard, determined to be a scholar in Islamic art. And the year I graduated, there was only one job in the field. It was a very senior position at the Smithsonian Institution. And I didn't apply because I had just finished my dissertation and realized there was no way that I would get that job. But there were no other jobs in the field. And there's something called the College Art Association, which is more like a cattle market. You go there and you sort of knock on doors and hope that somebody's going to be nice enough to give you a job. And there were no jobs in my field, so I felt terrible. I was wandering down these corridors thinking, can I find anything that I might be able to do? And I saw a little sign. They have these papers on the doors that you sign up for hours of interviews. And there was a job as the director of the College Art Museum at William and Mary. And I realized that nobody had signed up. So I put my name on it and showed up at 2:30 or whenever I was supposed to show up. Had a very nice conversation with Tom Graves, who was the president of William and Mary, who was looking for somebody to found a college art museum. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, I got the job. And I am convinced I was the only person who signed up on that sheet of paper. Now, I don't want to say that I removed it after I entered in, but so I became the founding director of a tiny, minuscule college art museum in Williamsburg, Virginia. But I learned how to run an art museum, or I thought I learned how to run an art museum. And I discovered that there are certain pleasures of working across disciplines and with people and building an institution. That was all going along swimmingly until I got a call from Tom Lawton, who was the director of the Freer and Sackler Galleries in Washington, and who said, you know, you didn't apply for this job we advertised a couple of years ago, and we wonder if you'd come up and talk to us. And I said, well, why would I do that? And he said, well, you know, we offered the job to somebody, and he was unable to take it in the end, and we'd love to have a chat with you. Went up to Washington, had a conversation with Tom Lawton, and by then Milo Beach, my old professor from Williams, had become his associate director. And I remember the conversation vividly because he said, why didn't you apply for the job initially? And I said, well, I didn't apply because I didn't want to waste your time and I didn't want to get my hopes up, and it just didn't seem appropriate. And he said, well, actually, you're the only PhD in Islamic art apparently in the country that didn't apply for the job. And we settled on this wonderful person, but we didn't really have a backup. And that's why we want to talk to you. So I got the job because I was the only person who didn't apply. I mean, it wasn't because I had anything to offer. It was really, once again, serendipity kicking in. And I had a fabulous time at the Smithsonian, you know, really in the maw of my field. The 1980s were great years to be at the Smithsonian. There was a tremendous amount of money from Capitol Hill. Islamic art was slightly esoteric, but there was an audience. Freer and the Sackler Galleries are among the most exquisite places to work, certainly in this country. And that was all moving along nicely until the late 1980s, when I realized that actually I liked running a museum, that having done my work as a curator, having written books, I also had ideas about how to run a museum. And there is nothing worse for a director of a museum to have, worse than having a curator on your staff who thinks they can do it better than you. Very bad thing. And I adored Milo Beach, who was the director by then, and I realized that I needed to see if I could actually really run a museum on my own. This is where Max and my story reconnects, because we shared the directorship of the Art Gallery of Ontario, me in the early 1990s and Max in the mid-1990s. But what happened was, I decided that I wanted to run a museum. I looked around for available jobs. One of the few, but certainly one of the most interesting, was as the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I knew about the Art Gallery of Ontario, having visited it many times because my wife is Canadian. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting museum and has real potential. So I applied for the job, and to my surprise, got an interview, got another interview, and eventually got the job. And I was so thrilled by this. I thought, wow, this is fantastic, until I realized years later that they had decided that they wanted an American director who could bring American know-how and the sort of American entrepreneurial spirit. And I was the only American who apparently applied, so. Luck is, you got to take luck where you can find it. And I had a fantastic time. I loved being at the Art Gallery of Ontario. It is a great museum. Matthew Teitelbaum, the current director, who was a chief curator under me and under Max. I mean, you're looking at two generations of directors who helped build, I think, a really great place in north of our border. And I was actually merrily going on my way. We had a very difficult moment, not unlike the present, economic crisis, layoffs. We were on the rebound. Life was good. When I got a call from a woman named Nancy Pyle, who had been a fellow graduate student in Islamic art at Harvard, and had been a very good friend. And I kind of lost track of her over the years. But she had become a headhunter. And she invited me to apply for the job at the Museum of Modern Art, which had been open. And my initial reaction was, no. It's a very difficult job in a very difficult city, and I am just not the right person.
And I'll interrupt your story by sharing with you that I was a candidate briefly for that job, which I haven't really talked about before. But why not? There were two headhunters for that job.
That's correct.
Nancy got the job after the first headhunters were fired. And the first headhunters called a few folks, and I spoke to them. And so did Bob Buck, who was director of the Brooklyn Museum. And the anecdote that stays with me is how ham-fisted the search was. These headhunters who had an office midtown said to Bob, who ran the Brooklyn Museum of Art, "So, do you get into the city much?" So it didn't end well, let's put it that way, and the board of MoMA tossed them out and hired Nancy, and back to your story.
And again, Nancy was a classmate, older than both of us, but certainly a Harvard graduate student at the time we were there. So I actually said to Nancy, this is just not right. I don't think so. But because we were very good friends, Nancy called up my wife, Susan, and she said to her, "Why is your husband being such a jerk? Just tell him to go and have an interview." So to make a long story short, I did go down. And it's one of those things, it's a kind of life lesson to remember that we all have preconceived notions about other people, about situations, and inevitably they're different than your preconceived notion. So I went down expecting to see a kind of ham-fisted, monochromatic group of people and not be sort of have my prejudices confirmed. What I discovered was a fascinating group of individuals who were really open to the kinds of issues that interested me, a remarkable group of curators who, rumor had it, were sort of very difficult princes who guarded their territory very carefully, all of which may have been true at some legendary past, but was certainly not true when I arrived. They were actually very open to the idea of collaborating across departments, working in new ways. And to my utter surprise, and I really mean utter surprise, I was offered the job. And I remember a conversation with one of the trustees as I was sort of thinking my way through. He said, "Well, what you really have to understand, young man, is you're going to be offered this job once in your lifetime, and this is now." And, well, what are you going to say?
Well, taking us forward then, you've made enormous changes at the museum in many respects, obviously the physical plant being simply one of them, but the challenge that you've managed very gracefully is balancing making MoMA still a place of authority, but also a place of boundary crossing. And how do you do that in your head, and how have you managed to pull that off, would you say?
It's a really great question, Max, and it's certainly something not only I, but the entire staff of the museum think about a lot, because and maybe coming from a field other than modern or contemporary art, in fact, a field beyond even European art, gives you a perspective that there is no dogma. Actually, there are multiple points of view and multiple perspectives at all time, and that you can be authoritative without being dogmatic. And that actually your authority, to the degree you have it, comes from conviction, comes from your ability to engage multiple voices, to recognize that the plurality of what we feel, believe, think, and know is what gives us distinction. And it wasn't, again, I'd like to feel that I played a role in that, but I think, in fact, there had already been a generational shift among some of the senior scholars and curators who, in an earlier generation, might have felt that it was utterly essential to protect the legacy of Picasso, to take a point that is central to our institution. But by the time I arrived, recognized that even an artist as central to our understanding of modern art as Picasso or Matisse were subject to a great deal of debate and revision. And what I've tried to do is instill the kind of qualities that I learned at Harvard of debate and discussion, that what makes working in a museum such a privilege, an honor, is that we are venues of contention. In the best sense of that word. We are the crucible in which ideas are worked out, in which the debate over what's significant, what's insignificant, who's legendary, who isn't, is forged in our galleries, in the discussions we create among ourselves and with our public, and that there's a pleasure that comes with that that's unique. And I think if we've succeeded, and I don't believe you ever succeed, you're always working towards a goal, and some days it feels really good, and other days you wonder how you could have slipped so far back. But if we've succeeded, it's because we've tried to create a climate within the institution's staff, but that extends to our public, that says, this is a place where your ideas matter, where your thoughts count, and while what we argue for in our galleries, we argue passionately for, we recognize that it's only one of many arguments that could be made.
That's well said, and I think it captures the spirit of your curators. There is, however, a countervailing reality, which is you haven't done a great deal to uncouple the departments as they've traditionally been since the days of Alfred Barr. So tell us what that's about, of maintaining the hegemony of painting and sculpture, which doesn't really exist as a field any longer in the same way.
Yes, the Museum of Modern Art is structured curatorially by media. So we have a department of painting and sculpture, photography, film, media and performance, drawings, architecture and design, and so on. And that structure came out of Alfred Barr, the museum's founding director, thinking about the language he would have used, a modern aesthetic. What constituted a modern aesthetic, and wanting to represent that modern aesthetic across the disciplines that constituted such an aesthetic. And he had gone to the Bauhaus in Germany and studied the way the Bauhaus, which was this legendary school in Dessau, Germany, where film was taught, photography was taught, printmaking was taught, and so on. And he took that media-based discipline and made it the structure of our curatorial discipline. And I've thought a lot about changing that.
So tonight you're announcing that change.
That's right.
Very exciting.
That's right. We're going to concentrate on Islamic art. You heard it here first. But what I realized is any organizational structure for a museum is utterly arbitrary. It's a kind of convenient taxonomy. You could do it by decades. You could say we'd have the department of 1900 to 1925, the department of 1925 to 1950, and within that, everything would be multidisciplinary. Or you could do it by theme, right? You could say we're going to focus on portraiture, landscape, genre, whatever. Whatever you do, it's an arbitrary division that is a convenient way of simply organizing bodies of material. And what I realized was that, for better or worse, we had decided on using media-based taxonomies to organize material. And the value of that is, at the very least, they don't impose any historical schema. Painting and sculpture is neutral on the subject of whether it's from 1880 or 2000. And that the dilemma became, if you've got media-based departments, how do you create interdisciplinary dialogue so that someone working in drawings, prints, photography, and painting, interested in mid-century art, have a conversation with each other? And we ultimately came up with, I think, at least for the moment, a workable solution, which is we created two interdepartmental working groups. One is called the Modern Working Group, and that aggregates every curator in the museum interested in modern art, by which we would say anything pre-1960. And they meet once a week together. There are probably 15 or so curators who gather, and they talk about the issues germane to thinking about art from the period pre-1960. We created a contemporary working group that does the same thing for art post-1960. And there are curators who actually migrate between those two groups because their field straddles those again, arbitrary boundaries. 1960 or 1970 is no more pertinent to defining modern art than 1980 would be. And by having created a kind of horizontal structure that lets curators, regardless of their discipline, engage with each other, I think we have allowed the convenience of taxonomy to merge with the reality of how artists work, which is not to worry about whether they're working in photography or painting. Mm-hmm. Will this hold in 15 years? I don't know. I mean, I think a good institution challenges itself, queries itself, and if there were a better way to do it, I certainly wouldn't resist it. It just seemed that under the circumstances, the structure still had merit, because at the end of the day, this glass has to be kept by somebody. And it might as well be kept by somebody whose field was glass than somebody whose field was simply 1990s.
Mm-hmm. So in looking at the choices you've had to make since the economic downturn, are there some elements of change, if not then in the taxonomy of the collection, elements of change to the Museum of Modern Art that either we will see or that you're coping with right now?
Well, Xanax is really helpful. I find 2 a day, it's fabulous. I think almost every museum in this country is struggling with how to recalibrate. And the corporate world perhaps does this better than we do. Maybe it doesn't. But I think we're in a recalibration mode, and none of us really knows whether we're turning the dial a quarter of a notch, a half turn, or 2 full turns. And my feeling is that we need to turn the dial slowly and carefully so that we don't lose what has been achieved across this country, which is really the premier museum network of any country in the world. And I travel a great deal, as I know you do, Max, and I see great museums around the world, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, but I don't see any place that has the complexity, the richness, the diversity of what we as a whole in this country have created in terms of exhibitions, acquisitions, educational programs, publications, all of you. So, despite the kind of trauma of the current financial situation, our goal is to turn that dial very carefully and not to go any further than we have to. Of course we have to make change. We've had the luxury, being in New York, of being able to run an exhibition program that you could say was on 12 cylinders. There were very few, if any, exhibitions we couldn't do. I mean, we could fail to do them by not having the boldness, not having the intellectual capacity, but we had the resources to do them. And to do them in a kind of idealized way. Tabula rasa, tear the walls down, reconceive the galleries, put it all up, and tear it all down again next week. And it allowed us to be maybe a little lax in demanding of ourselves tough decisions. So I certainly think one of the consequences of this environment is very sharp decision making. That's not so bad. Mm-hmm. I don't mind having to say, okay, maybe we're not going to do 12 exhibitions this year, we'll do 9, but each one is really going to count. And I don't mind, in fact, I actually like the fact that we now have to say, you know, we're not going to tear the walls down every time we do an exhibition. We're going to work within the structure we've created for ourselves. And periodically, of course, if you have to change something to make it work, we'll do it, but we can be less wasteful. And that's actually being environmentally sensitive. And it's not that I am a convert to green, although we're sitting in a space that is a convert, in a way, to a sustainable environment. That's not so bad, having to do that. But I think if we're lucky, if we're smart in conserving our resources, we'll get through this without fundamental ruptures to the fabric of what we're doing. Now, what do I mean by that? I think what has made the museum successful in the last decade or so has been that we have run a very nuanced, rich, complicated exhibition program. And we're going to really try not to give that up. Will we find new ways to do publications? Absolutely. And Max has been a leader in thinking digitally and thinking about new ways of distribution. Can we piggyback on that? Can we make digital publications really a viable means, not just to lower costs, because maybe in the end the cost structure isn't so different, but to increase distribution, to have more people potentially read our books, hear our lectures. That would be a great thing, and if this economy compels us to do that, I have no qualms with that.
Glenn, I think there's a perception about museums, especially those focusing on modern and contemporary art, that the art market is at the core in some ways of what you do and how you operate. Tell us, in fact, how the downturn in the art market or the softening has or has not affected MoMA.
Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that the price of art is dropping precipitously. The bad news is we don't have any money to buy it. So yes, I mean, the art, the contemporary, particularly the contemporary art world, enjoyed a kind of halcyon decade in which hundreds of new galleries, maybe thousands of new galleries were created. Hundreds, if not thousands, of young men and women became artists, and modern and contemporary art became hot. I remember when I started the Museum of Modern Art, which was only 15 years ago, you know, sure, we stood for modern art, but you know, we didn't really have an audience that was multiplying itself month over month, because the audience was really for Renaissance painting, classical art, more traditional forms of artistic expression. And in the last decade, modern and contemporary art became the hot subjects. The downturn in the art world has been brutal on artists. They're men and women just like you and me. They have to earn livings, they have mortgages, they have children. So while this is resetting the way we work, it's also having a devastating effect on a lot of people whose lives depend on a thriving art world. The museum world was never driven by the art world, if you want to segregate those two. We ran parallel to each other, we butted up against each other, and of course, we are in the business of supporting living artists, buying their work, doing commissions with them, engaging their ideas, and hoping that we're a platform for experiencing what the most innovative men and women in our society are doing. That won't change. The air will come out of the art world. It'll settle at some new level, and you can take this to the bank. It will return to what it was sooner or later. If you look at the art world, it dips, it rises, it dips, it rises. We're in the midst of a very severe dip. It'll bottom out, and it'll rise again. And it'll rise because we are not, as a culture, going to stop collecting art. And we're always going to want great works of art in our museums, on our walls, in our offices. And that will refuel the art world. We're going to be in a slower period. There's no question. We as an institution will buy less. And I suspect if we're buying less, many others will buy less. Hundreds of, maybe thousands of collectors who were capable of buying art, they're out of the market for a while. they may come back. If they don't, new collectors will come in. A lot of young men and women who were artists will probably have to find other jobs. Some of them may even give up being artists. But the core of it, I think, is pretty solid. I think even if we were in the midst of a deep depression, I think the core of it stays pretty solid. So you're going to see a lot of changes around the edges, but I don't know that you're going to see that much change in the center. That's my take on it.
At the center, there's been a lot of controversy in recent months around de-accessioning, around museums selling art, and the challenges for you are particular because you so often work with living artists. At the Whitney, we certainly had a proscription on selling art by living artists because it could ruin their career. How do you feel today's argumentation is going? It's pretty messy out there about should museums sell art? If so, what happens to the proceeds? Should there be any give in our current belief that it should only go back to buying art?
Let me take it from the back to the front. Like the Whitney, we have a policy at the museum that we don't sell the work of living artists because we would not want to inadvertently affect their career. We do trade the work of living artists with their permission, and that gets done periodically, where you'd go to Jasper Johns and say, you know, we've got this great picture of yours, but we're lucky enough to have an even better one. Would you be willing to let us trade this picture for some other moment in your career? And that happens with some frequency. We were an institution that was founded on the idea that our collection would be metabolic. That's Alfred Barr's word, self-renewing. That we would collect aggressively, and that we would then sell what we had bought in order to continue to buy what he would have called progressive art, that is the art of the next generation. So when we were founded in 1929, we had no collection. By 1931, Lily Bliss gave us 110 objects, including several very important works by Degas. She gave, and Cezanne and many others, but the Degas you'll see in a moment are very important. And she expressly gave them to us with a written imperative to sell what we wanted to sell in order to buy something that's more important. So we sold the Degas in 1939 to buy the Demoiselle d'Avignon, certainly our most important painting, and some would argue the single most important painting of the 20th century by Picasso, and the Postman Roulin, and Matisse's Dance, and Andy Warhol's 32 soup cans, and I could go on and on. Every one of the major iconic paintings in our collection, and the same is true for photography, architecture, and design, are the result of de-accessions, of selling something in order to buy something else. However, we have adhered very carefully to the general proscription in our field that you only sell works of art in order to buy other works of art. This is fraying because you've got many smaller organizations around the country who are under such severe financial pressure that they are looking at selling works of art in order to sustain their basic operations. And the AAMD guidelines, the Association of Art Museum Directors, are very clear about this, that is absolutely prohibited. I have a slightly different take on it than many of my peers. I think these are brutally difficult times. I believe that the survival of our art institutions is vital and central, and that any policy is always worth reviewing and thinking about whether or not it is still the appropriate policy. And I'll give you, and I don't believe you review it in the light of just the urgency of this moment, because then you're making very short-term decisions. But I think that we should think carefully about what makes our museums great. And I'd frame it in the following way. The 20th century was in many ways America's century, for all sorts of reasons. And one of the beneficial byproducts of it being America's century is our museums and our donors had enough capital that they could acquire works of art with a kind of aggressiveness never seen before, certainly in this country and maybe anywhere else in the world. The result is we have museums that have transferred the richness of Europe and Asia and Latin America to the shores of North America. And I wonder whether the 21st century will not be a century of American power and capital, but maybe a century of regrouping and rethinking, where instead of our institutions being magnets for collecting, they become centers of programming. And that we're going to have to look at the resources of our collections as a way of ensuring that we have the richest, finest, most significant programs of any museums in the world. And if we are in a world in which this transition is occurring, from our ability to be magnets for collecting to our ability to be centers of programming, then we have to ask ourselves, what are the resources required to ensure that that programming occurs? And what are the role of our collections in enabling that to happen? And that's the context in which I think there's a much more interesting conversation.
Well, and you were just in Dubai. So when we talk about the American empire finding itself a bit diminished, whatever the fluctuations are there in terms of wealth, there's clearly something changing. So are you contemplating getting involved in the Gulf, the way so many of our colleagues are, and what's your general thought about where that tendency is going?
I think what I want to elaborate on what Max is saying, in that the Gulf at the moment, despite the economic situation, is a hotbed of museum activity. Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Doha, just to mention 5 places, are all in the midst of major museum initiatives, sometimes multiple museum initiatives, and there is a vast amount of capital that is being spent not simply on building buildings, which is ultimately not that interesting, but on building collections. And that's been going on actually for a healthy decade and is going to continue to go on, because till the price of oil goes to zero, those are cultures that recognize their future is in expending current dollars to build their society for the next generation. But China, India, parts of Latin America, Brazil in particular, they're all doing the same thing. Korea. They're where we were 125 years ago.
You notice how he's avoiding my question about the Gulf.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to it. We decided as an institution that our strength lay in being in one place at one time. And we're, for better or worse, in midtown New York. And while we have our affiliate, PS1, across the river in Long Island City, trying to run multiple institutions doesn't work for our party. And by that I mean, we believe, perhaps still naively, that we tell a story about modern art. Not the story, but a story. And for us to tell that story, we need very specific works of art in our institution arguing that story. So while we are generous lenders to exhibitions around the world, we wouldn't want to have an institution that argued our story, that couldn't tell it with the works of art we think are central. So we are and will continue to look at professional relationships where we can do training, where we might be able to share ideas, where we can work in a collegial way. But I don't see us building in sort of in a hard way, hard costs, an institution that we are responsible for.
Yeah. We were talking earlier about the Miller House and Garden in Columbus, and on May 1st we take on the stewardship of that property. And you had a very close relationship with Philip Johnson, and his glass house, of course, is the most significant house we've all followed in modernism and architecture. So if Philip were still alive, what sort of advice, getting through Philip's sense of humor and so on, what kind of advice would you think he would give us in managing that remarkable modern space?
First of all, I think Philip would be very proud that you've done that. Philip was a very wily character. I mean, he lived to his late 90s, and we got to know him really in the last decade of his life. And he was impish. He was wily and he was impish, but he was also a very adventuresome thinker. He was fearless in sort of pushing ideas around and making these great leaps of the imagination. And I think he would be very proud that the architecture he felt was central to his own intellectual formation was sufficiently important that museums would want to preserve it and care for it. But I think he would say, and now you'll just have to forgive the vernacular, don't it up. By which he would mean the following, I think. Because he and I had some conversations about a similar subject. He gave to the National Trust his complex in outside of Greenwich, Connecticut. He built himself this beautiful glass house that Max referred to, and a series of pavilions. And at one point actually offered them to the Museum of Modern Art long before my tenure, and the museum declined. Something I regretted, because I would have snapped them up in a second. I think you can make this work. But he would never want them to be museum exhibits. For him, the architecture was about the ability of someone to imagine they were living in it. So I guess his admonition would be, don't make it a museum. Mm-hmm. Somehow find a way to keep it alive as a work of architecture. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of architecture, you're in the epicenter of both design and architecture today. And I'm curious how the celebrity culture around both design and architecture has affected the way MoMA addresses it, because the seductions are constant, the pressures, the media. How do you maintain an intellectually rigorous program in design and architecture with all that noise?
Well, there's a lot of noise. I mean, there's a lot of noise. Celebrity architecture has been around for a long time, but the last 10, 15 years has seen it escalate into something like rock stardom, which has its good side. It means that people generally are far more aware of architecture and far more interested in learning about what architecture can do and how architects work. We have tried with some success, but certainly not by any means enormous success, to insulate ourselves from that, to be aware of it, but through our curatorial staff, to be one step behind it, to still try to make discerning, critical decisions about architecture that matters, practices that are important, projects that are significant, and to not so much go against the grain, but to be willing to not get caught up in the fervor of the moment. One thing we did was to, at PS1, which has a very large courtyard and is in part of the city where you can do this, create a program for young architects. Architects at the inception of their career, anything but celebrity architects. These are the young men and women who mostly toil in the back office. And at the inception of their career, to offer them a project to build something on their own. And it's always in the summer, and it's the site of a summer dance program, and we ask them to essentially create the mise en scène. And that's a way of saying, for all of the Frank Gehry's and Jean Nouvelles and Rem Koolhauses of this world, there are also architects like Schopp and Bill Massey, names you probably won't have heard of and maybe never will hear of, but who are really the grit of what makes architecture exciting. And to try and do exhibitions that focus on architects and architectural practices that are less well known. But having said that, those celebrity architects are celebrated because they often make very great works of architecture.
Help us with just a last question for me, and then I'd love it if anyone has any questions from the floor. Some advice for the students, not just the young architects, but students who are watching who might be thinking about a career in museums, having heard your odyssey a little bit. I know giving advice is tough to people you don't know, but what rolls around in your head when people ask you that question?
You know, I think that those of us who were lucky enough to first study art history and then one way or the other become curators and directors all got here, I think, through a very similar passion. The sense that what we do is such an incredible privilege, such an honor to be able to look at and think about objects of such extraordinary beauty, to write about them, to fondle them, to touch them, to talk to colleagues about them, to meet living artists, to learn how they feel, how they think, how they work. That for me, the only advice I have is follow your passion. And while that may seem trite, this field, the museum world, is not a field that leads to riches. It's not a field that leads to fame. It's a field that leads to such enormous personal pleasure that if this is what you think about when you wake up in the morning, and it's the only thing you can imagine yourself doing, then just go for it, because you're going to end up one way or the other discovering something rewarding and fulfilling. Maybe it leads to being a director, maybe it leads to being a curator, maybe it leads to being an administrator. But whatever it is, the pleasures of this field is the pleasure of working with incredibly intelligent men and women who believe so deeply in what they do, who are so convinced of the importance of art to our lives, that it's the passion that you bring to it that defines what you get to do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So, happy to take a couple of questions from those who might have them.
The first is, I hope I did talk about the fervor of what's taking place in the Gulf. I do think the Middle East is alive. It's fascinating. I think that we have lived for 8 years under an administration that, like many other administrations, framed its position against another position. So we had the other to contend with. And of course, the events of 9/11 were traumatic for this country. But the Middle East is a complicated place. Islam is not simply a religion. It's a group of many different, it aggregates many different cultures, many different peoples, all of whom have very different positions. Secular Turkey is as secular and democratic as the United States. Shia Iran is fundamentally different than Sunni Morocco. The conservative Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia could not be any more different than the Shia and Sunni of Lebanon. In other words, we have a tendency to see this world as homogeneous, when in fact it is utterly heterogeneous, which doesn't mean there aren't terrible issues and problems that have to be resolved. But I actually took enormous hope in the current administration's willingness to, almost with the stroke of a pen, say that we are not going to continue a politics of confrontation, that we are going to engage those who we don't understand, those who are not necessarily our friends, in a constructive dialogue. And so we invaded Iraq, to give a very precise example, in order to extirpate the perceived terrorists that were there and reshape the balance of power in the Middle East, without thinking about who was the likely beneficiary of this: Iran, a country with which we had huge issues. So now we're suddenly realizing, oh my goodness, Iran has become a powerhouse in the Middle East. Well, it always was a powerhouse in the Middle East, but we need to contend with it. And I think this administration has really made all the right moves here. It doesn't mean things are going to get better. It doesn't mean we'll suddenly solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It doesn't mean that Iran is going to abandon its nuclear desire. But it does mean that with a conversation in place, we have a much better chance of creating understanding. And with understanding, we have a much better chance of creating the kind of dialogue that will lead to a changed attitude and a changed position. So I'm actually very hopeful. I think there are horrible issues yet to be resolved, but I think we have begun a process that recognizes that confrontation is not the solution in the Middle East. I certainly see this as a moment to reconsider almost everything we do and to take advantage of those opportunities that make sense for us. New York is a very particular environment because it's one of the few in this country where there are multiple museums in a very small sort of topographical space, often with overlapping, if not competing interests. So you have the Met, MoMA, Guggenheim, Whitney. You could add to that the new museum now, Exit Art, et cetera, et cetera. And what I do believe is a small number of us are going to make much better decisions than a large number of us. The ones who make the better decisions are going to come out of this crisis exponentially stronger than the ones who make the less good decisions. I'm a really binary thinker, and when I talk to graduate students and interns and people in the field, I really try to emphasize the point that at any given moment you're making so many decisions, and some of them are going to be good and some of them are going to be bad, but the reality is you only get to make a decision and then you got to move on. So collaboration, sure, where it's appropriate, but I think that they may not be between museums. They may be between the Museum of Modern Art and Carnegie Hall. Maybe between the Museum of Modern Art and the Metropolitan Opera. Because what are we as an institution looking for? Or maybe that's another way of framing it. We're looking for visitors, we're looking for members, and we're looking for financial resources. Right? That's what we're really in the marketplace looking for. So we'll look very carefully at who's visiting our institution, who's visiting other institutions, and where there's overlap and where there's competition. We'll look very carefully at who's a potential member and what does it take to make him or her a member of our institution. And if partnering with the Whitney or Carnegie Hall will be an inducement, we'll think about it. We'll look very carefully at who has the financial capability of supporting our institution and look at whether that is something we can depend on in a monogamous situation or whether we have to look at a polyphonous situation. We'll look at, can we share resources? Marketing resources. Maybe a joint marketing campaign will be beneficial. We'll look at all of those strategies, but I suspect there'll be relatively little of that taking place. And if it does take place, I suspect it's going to take place between museums and other cultural institutions, but not other museums. Now there are spaces. Art Babel just started here this week, brainchild of Max and this institution, and it will be a forum for a number of museums to collaborate, share resources. It'll become a kind of its own space. But I still feel that there's a difference between the virtual world that we are learning to navigate and the hard space of our institutions. And we've grown our audience by almost 100% in less than 5 years. And with that, we have trebled our membership. And as I look at, so we've gone from about 1.5 million to this year we'll be at about 2.8 million in total visits on site. Membership went from 33,000 to 124,000 as of yesterday. So I look at that and I think, okay, if I'm going to start collaborating with other institutions, I have to understand what they're bringing to the table that's a net benefit to us. Of course, we have a responsibility. Cultural institutions are not like corporations. Our goal isn't to win. Our goal is to be part of a rich matrix of other cultural institutions. So there's a side of this that's also about how do we support other organizations within our network. But having said all of that, I think collaboration in the New York environment is going to be a difficult one to see fully realized. But I want to come back to your point, opportunity. I think that's in danger. There is opportunity. I think there's huge opportunity for every one of our museums in the country, and certainly in a place like New York. That opportunity is to strengthen our relationship with the public, to strengthen our commitment to our members, to strengthen our role within the city. If out of this we come out as major civic entities, maybe even defining civic entities, we will benefit from that in ways we can't even anticipate today. And that's where we're focused. What do we do to be defining civic entities within our little world? And if that means partnering with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we'll do it in a nanosecond. But if it means creating programs for a public school system on our own, that's what we're going to do. We're looking at it very much from how do we position ourselves for 5 years from now when the city is booming again, and we will have been considered a defining player in that regeneration. Does that make any sense?
I think we're going to use that last expression of coiled energy of my friend and colleague to close the evening, and thank all of you for coming, but especially to thank Glenn for sharing with us your story and what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you.